You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship with David C. Baker and Blair Enns.
David, I'm really looking forward to getting into this topic of yours, but I have to confess that when I first read it, I thought, oh, that's not going to be very broadly relevant. And then I realized I had misread it. So the topic is designing your service offerings.
What do you think I said?
I read it quickly and I got the words mixed up. I thought it was offering service design, why our listeners should all be in the service design business.
I should just assume you don't read much of what I write very carefully.
That would be a good assumption.
No, it's designing your service offerings. Okay, so when you read it correctly, did you think it was an interesting topic? Honestly, now?
Yeah, honestly. In fact, I thought, wow, there is a lot of depth here. And I'll confess, there's a bunch of stuff here that I never thought of before. So,
welcome to my world. I'm leading you down many new avenues of thought and exploration.
Welcome to the alternative reality in your mind. It just happens to line up with reality this time. Okay, enough banter.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about this?
Because it was my turn and our audience was...
Why am I letting you talk about this?
It was my turn, and because our audience was ready for something really interesting.
Substantive.
Yeah. The 6 things I cover in a total business reset, this is one of them, service offering design. And I just find it so interesting. It's one of those areas where when we get deep into it, it seems to surface all kinds of things that people haven't thought of before. So there's that, but it's also, when you sit back and you realize it's like, oh my God, how did our service offering mix end up right here? It's sort of like, have you ever looked at all the laws that are still on the books in different communities?
It's like code in Microsoft Windows. They just keep adding it and they never take any away.
Yeah. They should not be allowed to pass a new law in any municipality unless they subtract 3. It's like, that's the only way we're going to clean all this stuff up. And service offering design is the same way. That's what got me thinking about this. This stuff gets more complex over time, just like your schedule gets more complex over time. And every once in a while, you've got to have a hanging in the public square of all your bad service offering ideas. When you were panicked at one point about not having enough work to do, and you decided to add 7 things, hoping that somebody would read this list and hire you for something. And then there's just all kinds of other areas too. So, but that's the big one. It just gets too complex over time. And sometimes it's because clients ask you to do things, right? And that's a good way to grow when you are doing more things for the same clients. That's a really good way to grow. Or you hire some overpaid person. Well, in your mind, maybe overpaid, probably not overpaid. And you think, okay, one way to justify this hire is they're bringing this new expertise to the table. Let's use them in a new way. Let's add to our service offering list, and that'll justify hiring this more expensive person. Then over time, your service offerings just get really, really complex, and it gets disastrous. And so I think every once in a while, you got to step back and say, okay, folks, let's start over here. What do we really want to do for clients?
Yeah, pruning. It's coincidental. We're going through this right now. We're about to drop 3 of our training products and rebuild another one. So we'll get a whole lot simpler. And I really identify with, a few things you said. One is, what can we do to drive revenue? Let's get into this area, or let's deliver this in multiple ways. Speaking of my own business now, but I see it in our clients' businesses, our listeners. When you take stock of your current service offerings, it's not really by design. It's the things that you said yes to over the years. And to your point, I don't think you're making the case that quit saying yes to things.
No.
But just because you built some capability for one client doesn't mean that you necessarily need to start advertising, putting that offering on your website and starting to build a separate practice area around it. If we want to keep growing, we do have to prune from time to time. And I think that's your key point here.
Yeah, it is. I love speaking to the Society of Digital Group, and I was at their conference earlier this year, and the topic was service offering design. And I was real proud of myself because I thought, okay, I need to get a Cheesecake Factory menu. And I thought, well, I guess I could steal one, but that seems awkward. So maybe I just buy one on eBay. And I found one on eBay, I bought it, and I'm going to use this as a prop from the stage, right? Then, of course, I forgot it. So now I have this Cheesecake Factory menu, got nothing to do with it. Have you ever been to a Cheesecake Factory?
I'm sure I have.
Oh, man, it's not as bad as going to a Waffle House or something. You can admit it if you've been to one.
I've only ever been to a Waffle House with you.
An awful house, as we call them, yeah. But back in 1978, the Cheesecake Factory had a one-page menu. And now it's legendary because there are 250 plus items on 21 pages. And it's just overwhelming. It's overwhelming for anybody who eats there, but can you imagine how overwhelming it is for anybody working in the kitchen, too? So what we're saying is, well, we're actually not just saying let's slim this menu down. We're saying maybe we ought to go to a, how do you say that? Fixed price menu? What's the French pronunciation of that?
Well, we've done this before. You put me on the spot. It's prefix.
Prefix. No, that's Prefix. Is that really how you pronounce fixed price?
Yeah.
Okay.
Prefix.
Okay.
Oh, that's a horrible French accent. Apologies to all my French friends.
If Marcus leaves this in here, we're screwed. And now, of course, that's a guarantee that he will.
I go into the restaurant, I know what you mean, and you get the menu with all of these different options. I just hand the menu back to the server and say, I'll have this special. I'll just take my chances because
Right.
I am not willing to make the cognitive investment required to sort through all those
Right.
items. I just want to eat. If you're in a restaurant that has that many items, the food isn't any good anyway, right? We all understand that.
Right. Why doesn't that translate into how we design our service offerings at firms like ours? It's so weird to me.
Yeah, I hear you. All right, so you've identified 5 hallmarks of poor service offering design. What are they?
Yeah. What happens when you haven't thought through this and you have too many service offerings? And after going through these 5, I'm going to suggest a particular mantra that I think will be really useful as you think through this. But the 5 are these. So one is that you end up with people who have to wear multiple hats. There's always going to be a little bit of that, particularly if you're a firm of a smaller number of people. But the idea of getting to be a bigger firm is in part the idea that the individuals on the team need to wear fewer hats. That's an advantage. Now, everybody doesn't feel that that's an advantage, but that really is an advantage because then they can get deeper, they can know more what they're talking about. If you've got lots of service offerings, then you have people who have to wear many hats and they have to fill in for each other. They have to be backup for somebody else. They have to have, it just kind of goes on. And you end up having people on your team, the ones who excel are the ones who are super smart, who can think on their feet. And it's really hard to find replacements for them because they have to be proficient in all of these areas. So that's the first, wearing multiple hats. And the second, this is maybe the biggest one. This is the one that causes people to think about their service offering design more than anything else. So let's say they have a large branding practice, so they do new identities for clients and so on, and then they have, because somebody has asked them to do it, they build website properties for those same clients. But they keep finding clients who want just the branding or they want just the website and not necessarily both. And what ends up happening is you have an underutilized department because you don't have a defined or prescribed path. You have clients who are choosing what they want to do for you, and you can't always predict that. That's not a part of your screening process. And so you end up with certain departments that are not busy as much as they should. And then you sit back and say, well, we can't just lay these people off and rehire them 3 weeks from now. What do we do? And it shows up in the profit of the firm. So I'm going to try to solve this with a mantra later, but that's the second one. You've got entire departments that are underutilized. You also end up, this one is subtle, and not a lot of people have seen it until I point it out, but you end up with multiple small companies under one roof. So if you have different service offerings, and you allow clients to pick and choose which ones, then in effect, you're working as a smaller entity for them. And you wake up one day and you realize, oh, our competition is smaller firms. So we're, say, a 30-person firm. That's a deep bench. We could do lots. We can almost be full service for our clients. But this client here is only using 5 of our people. And so they compare that.
Right. You're a collection of 5 or 6 5-person firms.
Yeah. And it shows up from a positioning standpoint. I've pointed that out in many cases, and I don't think anybody's ever quite realized, oh, that's why we're competing with smaller firms. It's because of that. Fourth is you really overcomplicate the whole AM and the PM component. So if you have AMs that have to understand, they have to speak intelligently to all of these different service offerings, or even PMs, then their job gets very, very complicated instead of slimming it down. And then finally, you end up being an order taker, back to this menu thing. Instead of saying, no, listen, you and I have been to the Catbird Seat restaurant here in Nashville, and it's a fixed price menu. It's the same courses for everybody. It's 8, 9, 10, 11 courses, and there isn't any choosing. I mean, you can skip it if you want, but they're still going to put it in front of you, as opposed to a cafeteria, sort of a menu, a Luby's cafeteria, where if you're giving clients all these choices and you're just standing there waiting for them to give you the order, then you become more of a client-driven firm and you're not driving that relationship forward. So those are the 5 areas, the things that happen when you haven't thought through the service offering design as well as you could.
And I'll just clarify, AM, PM, you mean account manager versus project manager. We've talked about the difference in the dynamics in those relationships in a previous episode.
Right.
And the Catbird Seat, I'll point out that the best meal I've had in North America, but that was a different chef ago.
Right.
I don't know if it's still as good, but it's a great restaurant in Nashville.
Yeah.
Okay, you referenced a couple times that you've got a mantra that you'd love to leave people with. Is now the time?
Sure. And it's very simple, but I hope it resonates with people. And it's this phrase: most of your clients should use most of your services most of the time. Now, I don't know what that percentage should be, but let's just presume it's 80% or something. So when you back way up into the new business process and you are deciding whether a prospect is a good candidate to be a client, you say, there's lots of other things like, are they big enough? Have they used a firm like yours before? You have access to decision maker, yada, yada, all those things that we've talked about a lot. But one of the other questions you should be asking is this: will this prospect use most of our services? And if they aren't, then you should pause for a second and decide whether or not you really want to work with this client, because you design your service offerings, which then flows into the people that you hire to do these things for clients. You design them with a particular path in mind. And when you deviate from that path, all of a sudden, this department or these 2 departments or whatever, they have less to do because the client isn't going to be using those services. So most of your clients should be using most of your services most of the time. That's the mantra for service offering design, and it needs to be way more intentional than it is. You don't just throw something on your website and then let clients choose, okay, I want these 2 out of the 7 things that you do. Now, obviously, you're going to do that sometimes, but ideally, the best clients are the ones who use most of your services most of the time.
So you would measure your current client base and the services that they're buying from you against that statement and ask, is it true? And if it isn't true, then it's, reading between the lines here, it's time to revisit your service offerings and maybe model out a new set of offerings. And maybe it's as simple as just pruning some.
Right.
I want to come back to your second hallmark of poor service offering design, and that was this idea of fragmentation, that you have entire departments that are frequently underutilized. And you made the point that a 30-person firm is competing against 5-person firms as an example, because they have these different service offerings and they're basically these different businesses, each selling its own service offering. There is the idea of practice areas that is valid in larger and growing companies, is there not? So if you think of a 100-person firm that has, say, 3 distinct practice areas, would you start to apply that mantra to the practice area itself? Because it seems to me that as businesses grow and you build these practice areas, you really, in effect, start to build real 3 different legitimate businesses under the same brand.
Yeah. And I think in that example, then it's less of a problem. So, for instance, if you think of a large law firm that might specialize in M&A work and taxation and IP, well, they don't feel like they can only work for clients that are going to use all 3 of those departments, because those 3 departments operate pretty much independently. They've got different partners that are scooping up business, in a new business setting, and they hire and they staff differently. It's almost like independent firms working under the same roof. But in the firms that are listening to this, they usually have more of an integrated service offering. And in that world where they don't operate independently, then they need to really operate together. And all of them need to be solving the big problems. Otherwise, you lose one of the biggest advantages you have being a larger firm, and that's that you're a larger firm, that you can solve big problems that smaller firms can't solve. But if you're competing, if 5 of your people out of 30 are solving a problem for a client, well, they could get the same thing at a 5-person firm too.
You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship. Your hosts are David C. Baker, author, speaker, and advisor to owners of expert firms, and Blair Enns of Win Without Pitching, the sales training and coaching program for creative entrepreneurs. For more information, go to twobobs.com. If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by telling a friend and rating us on iTunes. Thank you. Now back to David and Blair.
All right, we're talking about designing your service offerings. We've discussed the hallmarks of poor service offering design, and you've shared with us this core principle or mantra that most of your clients should use most of your services most of the time. What are the principles of good or effective service offering design?
Yeah, and there's 5 here. I would start by just noting something that McKinsey came up with many years ago, and they called it the consumer decision journey, or the CDJ. You'll see it referenced like that all the time. And that's simply to decide what your CDJ is. So when would a typical client come to you? Like, what are you going to do for them at first? And then what would be the logical thing you might do next, and then next, and then next? And that path would not vary all that much. You know, whatever that number is, I just threw out 80% earlier, but 80% of your clients would follow that same consumer decision journey with you. So determine what that is in your world. And that's where I would start. Just figure out what that is, as opposed to just taking clients wherever they come to you. There's an ideal starting place, an ideal next place, and the next thing they do is the end, and that would be the first.
All right, making note here. We're going to do this Win Without Pitching.
Yeah.
My team will say, we've already done that.
Yeah.
Go back to podcasting.
Wake up, please. Yeah. Catch up with us. We're ahead of you. And then the second would be to apply that to your screening process. So add that to the kinds of things that you're looking for when you evaluate a prospect fit. In other words, are they going to use most of our services? And are they going to use them in the order we want to do it? We talk about this a lot in terms of upstream. So if a client is hiring you to implement something and you kind of get uncomfortable with that, you'd like to do what I call the first room stuff instead of the second room stuff. So you would very seldom deviate from that, because you want clients to hire you always for this thinking first. And you don't even care too much if they go to that second room and hire you to do the recommendations or the implementation, but you're never going to work for a client unless they do this first stuff first. So part of the screening process is being aware of that consumer decision journey and evaluating clients to see if they're a good fit in terms of not just all those other things, but what services are going to use from you.
And would you overtly share that journey as a screening tool with a prospective client?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Could you see saying, hey, this is the path most of our clients take, and this is where we engage with them initially, and then almost always we move to these other issues or areas?
Yeah. And I think even putting it on your website, even before you give a verbal explanation to a client, for sure. And then you might say, listen, I know this doesn't fit right now. I just want you to know the way we normally work, and we'll make an exception here, but probably next project, we'd need to stick with this. But we understand why you need to dive in and just do this right now. But it's unusual for us to do that.
Yeah, I think a good way to think about the exceptions, we talked about this when we were discussing buyer types recently, and I said you sell excess capacity to price buyers. I think you think about project work the same way. So that work where somebody comes to you with a one-off, you don't want to build your business on that. But you would say to the client, you would share this map or consumer decision journey, as McKinsey calls it, with them and say, we provide these services along the arc of this path or this journey. But if you only need this one thing, I'll check. Maybe we have some capacity and we'll do it. And you come back and say, all right, we can do this. I have other criteria about project work, like you shouldn't have to compete for it. et cetera, et cetera. But you would think of that project work, that client who's just going to take one service once and leave, you would think of them as filling the spaces in your kind of inventory, I guess.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to the third one too, in that I feel like you ought to prioritize the clients who follow the standard path. By prioritize, I mean when you think about scheduling.
Right.
If a client comes to you and says, okay, we want to skip these next two things and go straight to that, then you might have to say, I mean, you wouldn't make this up, but if it's true, you would say, oh, we've kind of already reserved capacity for this, so we're probably not going to be able to do that. In your scheduling, how do you prioritize clients? What are the factors that allow you to keep responding responsibly to clients? Well, part of it is how they treat you. Part of it is, are they following a prescribed path and not sort of dumping surprises on you along the way? So prioritize them. That's kind of the third point.
Yeah, another way you would prioritize them is how much money they're spending with you. And if somebody's using most of your services most of the time, they're spending more money with you typically.
Yeah. And imagine how much easier it is to predict capacity and figure out staffing,
Right.
and how much you need to use contractors and so on. Yeah.
There are a lot of sleepless nights had by agency owners over not just the sales front, but the capacity and the planning front,
Yeah.
waiting for, hey, I thought we were going to be working on this now, avoiding log jams, et cetera.
I don't know for sure, but I suspect that a lot of the falling short in the profitability department comes from underutilized people. So the people are smart, the pricing is good, they've got great processes, but some department is consistently being underutilized, and that is going to show up from a profit standpoint. That's how service offering design, to me, has such an impact on the results of your business when you think about keeping them all busy.
All right. What's the fourth principle of good service offering design?
This one we've talked a lot about. I forget the name of it. It was something like staging your client engagements or something like that. But
phasing your engagements.
Phasing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's a whole episode we did on this, so we don't need to talk about it too much. But it's starting with some sort of a diagnostic or a plan or a roadmap or something like that. So it's not as important that clients finish in the same place with you as it is that they start in the same place with you. So whatever this consumer decision journey is that you're designing, it should almost always start at the same place. And that's the phased client engagement side. This is essentially doing what you would have done if you'd have written a 90-page proposal for free, and now you're getting paid for it. And the benefit to the client, in addition to just being a really great way to sample what it's like to work with you, is that you're pledging to spend the rest of their money really smarter because of all this pre-work that you've done before the rest of it happens. So that's fourth. Start with some sort of diagnostic plan or roadmap. Whatever the CDJ is, it should start with something like that.
Right.
And then the final one is just to think about, okay, so you have this way to start it, and then you have the 3 or 4 things you do in the deep parts of the relationship. But where people probably could do some more thinking is, okay, what do you do after that to stay involved with the client to whatever degree you want to? You may not want to, right? Sometimes this recurring revenue stuff can bite you in the butt. But if you want to stay involved with clients, what are some more episodic ways that you can do it that deliver really high value to clients? And you tack those on to the service offerings. They're obviously optional. Again, we don't care as much about how the relationship ends as much as the way it starts. But I'm talking about things like analytics and adjustment. So you come in every 3 months or something, or maybe it's training their people so that they don't need you as much, or helping them staff the department or something like that. It could be refreshing a content library, maybe some certification, whatever that is. But as important as how they start, how they end can be really interesting to think about. We're really good at designing the middle part. We're not as good at designing the first and the way that things end. And so if you really do a good job of service offering design, there's a lot you can do to think about, okay, how do you keep the client close to you and still make money on them without them getting tired of you? Those are the things that you're trying to balance on an ongoing basis.
It's a really profound, to me, observation that we tend to be really good at designing the middle part of the service. And then once we nail that, some of us get pretty good at the front end, at the diagnostic phase, and get pretty good at charging for it. And to your point, it's highly reassuring to the client when you do this properly to spend a little bit of money up front to ensure, almost as an insurance policy, that the remaining money will be spent wisely. And then that last part about, some form of audit or measurement that allows you to keep tabs on them as they self-implement or take the work that you've done out into the world to make sure that things don't drop off, that performance levels, whatever that means, remains high, and you're getting paid to keep an eye on things and then come back in, or you have the opportunity to come back in when you see where it makes sense to do so.
And the best evidence for the fact that we're really bad at the final phase is because we keep getting fired by every single client. Like, it may take a year or it may take 5 years, but we're always getting fired by our clients. So we're obviously not all that good at the final phase of service offering design.
Yeah, and some firms, there's just in the nature of what they do, it's harder to come up with that type of offering.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth exploring for every firm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. You and I both can think of probably a couple dozen firms where we've thought, wow, these guys are really good at new business. But they sure lean on it a lot because they can't seem to keep clients.
A lot of people come in the front door, but a lot of people go out the back door too.
Yeah.
I was just on the phone with a client this morning, and obviously I'm going to look at the website. I didn't know anything about them except what I learned on the website before the call. So this is an example of what you're not trying to do. They focus in healthcare, government, corporate and consumer, transportation, nonprofit, and energy. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, what is not covered there?
Pet stores.
And then the service offerings are branding, advertising, digital, public relations, and social change. Well, this to me smacks of somebody sitting down and saying, okay, what's our service offering design? All right, somebody get me a list of all the people we've touched. Now somebody else go get me a list of all the things we've done for them. And then you end up with a Cheesecake Factory menu. That's what this looks like. And instead, I'd love for there to be more cohesiveness, not only in your client base, but in what you do for your clients too. Let's say you've got 11 things you do. Well, maybe you ought to have 8. Let's say you've got 6. Maybe you ought to have 4. There's just room to recognize that over time, things tend to spin out of control, and you've got to come back and clean it up. A spring cleaning every day. It's spring right now. Maybe this is the time to do it. I like this topic because it's kind of short and sweet, and it just gets people thinking without a whole lot of direction. It just helps them think about it. And what I'm most interested in is people taking this stuff and applying it in a new business setting where they tend to favor the clients who are going to use all of the departments equally, the way that the departments are designed. And that makes for a much better experience for the client and much better experience for your team.
And maybe you've said this already and I've missed it, but do you have a target for how many service offerings a typical firm should have? And when they start to think about adding new ones, they should think about dropping one before they exceed that target?
Yeah, the target is fewer.
Yeah, fewer than what you have now.
Yeah. No, I think 3 to 6 is just about right, somewhere in there. It's really hard to pontificate without knowing the specific firms, but fewer would be the smart-ass answer, but probably 3 to 6, something like that, would be really healthy. And these are the kinds of decisions that they aren't emergencies. You can think about them carefully. You could even say, all right, for the next 3 months, let's see if anybody buys this, or let's see who's going to pay a premium for this. That would be another question, because really our positioning and our service offering design is not intended to keep us busy. It's to deliver a premium pricing experience for us. Will they pay a premium for this? Or if they won't, will we lose the client if we don't do this? There's lots of really interesting questions to ask yourself.
Yeah, and I love the exercise of asking, okay, if we've got all these service designs, if we could only have one, what would it be?
Right.
Okay, here's the one. If we could add a second one, what would it be? Okay, it's our lucky day. We get to add a third. What is it? And then just sit on that for a while. These 3, as we've said before, there's no growth without pruning.
Right.
So I really like this idea. Thanks for this. And you know what? Maybe it makes sense for one of your service offerings to be service design.
Oh, what a great idea. I wish I'd thought of that.
Then we will have covered both topics. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Blair.
Thank you for listening to Two Bobs with David C. Baker and Blair Entz. Subscribe and learn more at twobobs.com. That's the number 2, BOBS.com.